Welcome to the Cybersecurity Vault. I'm your host, Matthew Rosenquist, cybersecurity strategist and CISO at Eclipz. Today, we're going to talk about how nation-state cyber attacks are changing and how organizations should be adapting and preparing for them. Today, I'm going to be talking with Jeremy Strozer, who is a strategic risk and international security expert, Fulbright scholar, presidential management fellow, author, podcaster, improvisational actor, and inventor. And today's podcast is created in part by Eclipz, securing data in transit through any cloud, network, or device. Welcome, Jeremy, and thank you for coming. It is always a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks for having me, Matthew. Great to be here.
Now, we are seeing unprecedented activity by, shall we say, aggressive nations from around the globe, with Russia attacking Ukraine, China threatening Taiwan and expanding military bases in the South Pacific, and we won't even talk about surveillance balloons there. Um, we, we see North Korea intimidating its neighbors and really the world with ballistic weapons. These and a whole bunch of other nations, right, are considered some of the most active in offensive cyber warfare against global digital assets, nations, businesses, and technologies. So, what is the correlation between these geopolitical activities and aspirations and cyber attacks? And how does this geopolitical windstorm increase the potential for attacks?
So, no small question. The thing that really you're asking there is why does one relate to the other? Why is it that all this geopolitical activity with all these aggressive states is really a threat to my organization, whoever I happen to be? And I'll tell you that it's because there is no distinct line in terms of actors in war. And what that means is that over the 20th century, the movement from war taking place against combatants toward civilians, toward the unaffiliated, has been progressive and has almost replaced warfare between combatants with warfare by innocents, by civilians behind the line. And so any organization that's out there right now is a just and fair, although not legally, target for military action. And so as these countries are looking around and saying, how do I incapacitate my enemy? How do I terrify them to the point where I don't even need to fight them? Then they're going to take down the economy, the electrical infrastructure, which we could see Russia doing in Ukraine, both kinetically and attempting through cyber. And I'm going to take down all capacity my opponent has to fight, to sustain a war effort, or even to sustain the will to have a war effort. And so Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, others have different capacities in this space. And one of the biggest problems with that is that as they use these capacities, they then are now out in the public domain. And so criminal organizations then pick up that capacity and say, ooh, cool, what can I do with this? And what can I steal? And so it's not just a nation state problem. It then becomes a criminal problem with the same tools because now the tools are available. Does that answer your question, or would you like me to go into farther depth for that?
It does, but let me unpack this because you covered so much, and I want to dive into all the different aspects. But let's start with one of I think the most profound thing that you stated is everybody's on the table as a potential target, right? It may not be legal, but these nation states who make up their own laws and rules based on their aspirations. And it may be war, it may be, what Russia is doing to Ukraine, but it may just simply be their political aspirations. Maybe they don't want to get into a shooting war, but maybe they want to have the top currency in the world, or they want to be seen as the biggest trade partner, or whatever their aspiration is. Using cyber warfare and offensive cyber acts, right? Cyber attacks It seems like that, yes, this is now a totally viable tool in their toolbox. And over time, it seems like the world, right, these aggressive nations are more and more willing to pull that tool out of the toolbox, to use that in pursuit of those geopolitical aspirations and goals. I mean, are you seeing an acceleration here, or is this just kind of a new plateau that we're at, and this is just the new norm? This is what we should continue to expect at this level. Where are we at? Is it accelerating, or are we kind of leveling off here?
So I would suggest that it's accelerating. I think as technology gets cheaper and cheaper, and as the cost of conducting offensive cyber operations is becomes more appealing because it is really cheap to do this as compared to kinetic operations particularly, then it's that much more interesting and return on investment for these aggressive countries to do, and for these criminal organizations as well. And another component that makes cyber far more attractive is that it's hard to take a cyber event and say, okay, you have now crossed my red line and I'm going to fire a missile at you. Sometimes you don't know where to fire it. And sometimes it's just like, well, but that was all ones and zeros. Do we really want to blow something up? And on occasion, organizations, countries have decided it's worth it. The Israelis attacked a cyber organization with a kinetic weapon at one point, but that's really rare, few and far between. And so cyber is a great tool because it allows you to take an action to get a political objective, whatever that may be for your particular country or organization, and to achieve it without potential repercussions. And so, what's the worst you get is, an angry demarche, export controls, maybe, some kind of sanctions. That's not so hard and you could find your way around it. So it's really a cheap and non potential negative outcome approach to achieving your desired outcome. It's a great way to do it. Why not do more?
So not only is it a powerful tool, it can be very effective. And one of the things and I know you're a huge fan of history and research and so forth. For the longest time, when you wanted to influence your neighbors or influence the world, you needed to have a border, right? You needed to be able to influence them at a very, very close proximity, and you needed to be stronger. I mean, if you were going to poke a bear, you needed to be pretty strong to do that. And yet what we see with cyber, it's like the handguns of the old west. It's an equalizer. And everybody can get into this game. You don't have to be a top 10, even top 30 economy in the world to play at this level. And you don't have to have a border. It's digital. Again, it's the ones and zeros, and yet you can still influence and political activities in a foreign country, their policies, their economy, even their military capacity, or influence your military capacity by stealing their secrets, right? And we've seen that with some very notable hacks and data exfiltration out there. Is there any reason that we would think that this type of benefit, this type of warfare, isn't going to be embraced by every country out there in some way, shape, or form?
At the moment, I can't see why it wouldn't be. The only thing that might change that calculation is if a large country, probably either United States, China, or Russia, decides that they will result in kinetic action against the cyber actors in a way that effectively demonstrates some form of deterrence. I don't know how that would be done, but if somebody could figure out how to do that, then there might be a pullback. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. So unless it does, no, it is a Wild West. It is a democratization of the offensive capability. And yeah, you don't need a border, you don't need a country, you don't even need a lot of money. And you could change the outcome of elections to make a country more friendly to you. You could steal their military technology to make it so that you can be a pure competitor to them on the battlefield. Or you can take down their economy to make it so that their people are just like, ah, we don't want to do this, whatever it happens to be that they were trying to do against you. So, yeah, there's tons of ways you can influence outcomes, almost all of which do not require kinetic engagement. And so they make it cheap, and they make it so that everybody's fulfilling Sun Tzu's main creed is the best way to win is not to have to fight.
When we look at some of these attacks, and you have mentioned some of them, one of the ones that I've seen more and more are these nation states that are under sanction, that they are embargoed. And they're using cyber attacks essentially to get around those, to be able to get hard currency from the very countries that are putting the sanctions in place. And we've seen this with Iran, with North Korea, with Russia, where sanctions, from either major nations or whole coalitions of nations have clamped down on their economy, and yet they still want money for weapons of war. They still want money to keep their regimes in power, things of that sort. And they're using cyber attacks, ransomware, and other types of attacks to steal money. And it isn't even necessarily at the governments of those countries.
Oh, no.
It's targeting the businesses, the infrastructure, whoever they can take the money from, right? The easiest target. Because that's also supporting their domestic and international goals. Do you see this slowing down?
No, I don't see it slowing down at all. Although you are an advocate of not paying ransoms, and I am a big supporter of that. And I think that the more victims who don't pay a ransom, the more they can try to slow this down. But as long as people pay ransom, or the targets pay ransoms, this is going to keep going because, hey, it's a money-making scheme. And you brought up something specific there that I wanted to kind of dive down into, is that it's not the governments necessarily, and more often than not, that are the targets. It's private organizations, it's individuals. And the reason for that is they're the easier targets. Why go for the hardened bunker when you could attack the unprotected, person out in the prairie? And most organizations are that unprotected target. So go for them, take their stuff. They don't know what they're doing to defend themselves. They don't know not to pay the ransom. They're not going to listen to the FBI. They may not even call the FBI if they're attacked. And so get them, get their money. And, it's easy, it's cheap, and you get what you want out of it, and you don't have to deal with the defender. Great.
Which makes us all a potential victim, right? The small, the medium businesses, the large corporations, especially critical infrastructure, wherever they think, hey, this organization's going to pay. Do the hack, get the rich rewards, and the rewards are significant, unfortunately, right? There's, people are being, and organizations are being fleeced. I want to go back to one thing that you talked about, right, which was almost this retribution. If major nations or coalitions come back and say, all right, if you attack me in the cyber domain, I'm going to attack you back, or I'm going to either kinetically or even with cyber now, right, there's going to be repercussions. What we've seen in the past is difficulty of attribution, and you'd referred to this before. It's really tough in the digital world with ones and zeros to figure out, right, who those ones and zeros are truly coming from, who is malicious. We see governments not necessarily directly attacking from their offices, from their military or their cyber warriors. They're outsourcing it. And there tends to be, and I'm seeing it, I don't know if you are, but a greater and greater market for these cyber mercenaries. We see physical mercenaries, right? The most, famous in the news right now, you've got the Wagner Group, that are, independent but supported by the government, basically serving a single government, but it's a private military organization. The same kind of mercenary world I see is starting to grow in the cyber domain. And so you don't have to have experts in your backdoor, in your government offices, in your military infrastructure. You can simply outsource it, right? Outsource your cyber attacks. Is this something that you're seeing continuing to progress, will amplify over time? How is this going to evolve? Are we going to see it similar to how the private military organizations have evolved over time?
So one of the things you bring up is you don't even have to have this stuff in the government or in your, agencies. And I would suggest that you don't even want it there. You want it outsourced because that creates plausible deniability. Oh, that wasn't us. That was, private actors doing stuff on their own. Aren't they patriots? And so, and it's funny, you mentioned the Wagner Group is the same guy who runs that, Putin's chef. He ran and still runs the Internet Research Agency, which is attributed to all of the 2016 electoral interaction. So he's the one who started that.
What a coincidence. I'm sure that's a coincidence.
Yeah. And, it was funny is that, well, it's not funny. It's actually really sad. But Russia, in their attack on Ukraine, expected their outsourced cyber army to come and help them take down Ukraine. And they conducted some preliminary cyber activities to set the environment to prepare the battlefield. And what ended up happening, though, and Russia was surprised by this, and I think so was the West, is that most of those cyber mercenaries said, oh, no, we're not going to do it for you. We're going to go and defend Ukraine. And they started attacking Russia. And these were the same people the Russians had been paying this whole time. And they're like, wait, we thought you were on our side. And they're like, no, we're not on anybody's side. We want money. And so it's fascinating if you think about the Middle Ages and the rise of mercenary armies and Machiavelli's discussion in The Prince about how you use mercenary armies is you don't rely on them for the main operation. If you do, things bad will happen to you. But what you do is you use them to augment your force. And that is exactly what now Ukraine has been able to do with these cyber warriors is they are force augmentation. They are supplement to the main battle. They are not the battle itself. And I think what the Russians were trying to do there is influence the outcome of the war before the kinetic component ever began. And they misunderstood the environment in which they were operating, and therefore they failed. And so when it comes to will this increase, it of course it will. The money is there. But can countries or criminal organizations or whomever rely on these mercenaries to do their bidding for them exclusively? No, because they're going to go to either the highest bidder or potentially the right moral cause, depending on, how they're structured or what individual choices these mercenaries make. And that's going to determine potentially outcomes of conflicts.
And I think other nations, and I'll call out China for one, I think they're learning lessons. I think they saw that and realized, yes, our investment for internal hackers was probably a really good investment versus this outsourcing model. Outsourcing has its role, yes, but you know what? I really want to grow that sustaining environment, this talent pool over time. It's not a one-shot thing. The internet's not going to go away. Reliance on digital services and data, that's not going away. This just becomes more and more powerful. I want an in-house capability. So I think the rest of the nations, aggressive nations out there, are looking at the painful lessons that Russia learned and going, I'm not going to make that mistake. I'm not going to fall into that pit like they did. I'm going to adapt and adjust. And with that, right, I think these countries are putting their foot on the gas and accelerating what they're willing to spend. So let's talk about that for a minute because we've got we've got cyber criminals out there. We've got some very successful organized cyber criminals out there that make a lot of money, but it pales in comparison what some organization, cybercriminal organization can make and what they will turn around and reinvest. How much they will spend for a 0-day vulnerability for a major operating system or something like that. When we compare that to what a nation is willing to spend, it's not even close. So if we're really talking about nations are now moving to be more willing to conduct offensive cyber attacks, and they've now got the budget to, right? What are we going to see here from an investment perspective, increasing over time with all these nations investing in this? What's the threat landscape going to look like?
So it will just continue to proliferate. And there, I mean, it's not going to be a straight line. It'll be a geometric proportion because the opportunity is there. And other people will start participating in that. Other countries will start realizing, oh, I can do this too. And it's only cost this much, which sounds cheap, even though it's a huge investment. You brought up the Chinese internal investment versus the Russian external sort of mercenary one. And I wanted to spend a little time touching on that more because I think that's really important. Is if you think about the US military from the 1950s, well, actually, from World War II into the 1980s, the US military went from having the capability to do everything in-house to contracting out and having contractors do everything to the point where in the early 2000s in the Iraq Gulf War and Afghanistan, a lot of the supply, the logistics, everything was done by contractors. And it was only the tip of the spear that was the military. And what they found is that in some cases contractors are very effective, and in some cases contractors should not be there. Where in Iraq, the contractors actually caused a lot of problems because they started shooting everybody up and, you know, creating the environment in which the whole military operation was failing. And so if you think about what China's doing versus what Russia's doing and what other countries are learning from the process, is that if you have the in-house capability, you can control that more. You can push to the political objective you want. If you have a mercenary force, it's a lot harder to control, and the political objective you're seeking may not be achievable, particularly if you can't rely on those forces. And so if countries looking around then Iran, North Korea at what's going on, they're going to have to make that cost benefit analysis of, do we get more capability with the mercenary or do we get more control toward the political outcome we want with the in-house capability? And can we raise that here? Now, Iran and North Korea both have decent sized populations, but they don't necessarily have the investment in-house, in country, to be able to train a large cyber army. So how much do they need? Where is that balance point for them? And every country is going to have to make that choice themselves based on the resources they have available, money, people, technical capability. And then what are the political outcomes we seek? And are those mercenary versus in-house achievable? And it's sort of like an economic chart where you have the line of supply, the line of demand, and where you get that cross is where you go. They're going to have to find where that point is. And everybody's going to have a different point there because of what they bring to the table and what they demand out of the capability they are going to be using.
So it sounds like exponential growth. It's not going to as you said, just literally go, increase. We've got more countries doing more bad things because they see it as a means of benefit. They've got different options. They can grow in-house, they can outsource, or chances are they're going to figure out where in the middle, but either way, they're going to be investing. And even the small countries can gain benefit. Okay, so we've covered kind of the threat. This is the tsunami that's coming. Let's talk a little bit about the victims or potential victims and what can be done or should be done. That's where I want to go, right? Because I don't want to just make this fear and, doom and gloom. What can we do? And we just saw, rumblings about, a new presidential order that's going to be coming out, and I know it's still embargoed, and only, media companies have copies of the draft, but even they're talking about how in this next order there will be specific conversations or declarations around doing proactive offensive operations against entities like this to be able to undermine their operating infrastructure so that they can't conduct attacks or lessen their ability. It's not can't, but it's lessen their ability to conduct attacks. You had mentioned before, hey, organizations and governments may come out and establish policies or rules and say, hey, we can, launch a missile at you if you do this, if we can attribute it to you. It sounds like there's some things going on in the government. What do you see as we turn forward the next year, 2 years, 3 years, from a government perspective? And we'll cover the businesses in a second. Where do you see governments adapting to this pervasive threat that's growing?
Yeah, so you bring up the potential executive order. I look forward to seeing what the text is on that when it is finally released. And governments have a big role to play in this space. They can help degrade the capability of the adversaries. They can help harden the capability of the defense of the potential targets. They can help create communities in which those potential targets can work together to pool resources. And they have done all of those things. And they will continue to do those things, and to a greater capability, because there's investment taking place on this side as well. So that's exciting. There is also cooperation between governments, between the United States, the EU, Japan, Australia, the Five Eyes, whatnot, where they are working together to help identify who are these adversaries, what capabilities do they have, how do we take those down, how do we preempt them, how do we blunt them in some way. And so all of that is very useful. All of that does have an effect. The challenge with that is that the environment changes a lot. And when you confront a harder target, basically you slip off of it and you go find something softer. That's the way to go. And so this then gets to the discussion about what can potential targets do. Is they themselves need to not harden so much as make themselves so squishy that anyone who comes in there can't get out, can't find what they want, and just sort of gets stuck and lost. And that's where I really advocate.
Is squishy a technical term?
It's so not. No, but I struggle so much with everybody who's like, walls, put up walls everywhere. It's like, walls never stopped any invasion. They just make somebody go around it, or over it, or under it, or, make a hole in it. But what does stop invasions is elasticity. Because if you think about sort of, Russia against Napoleon, Russia in World War I, Russia in World War II, they had space. They could drown their enemy in geography.
And winter.
In winter. Winter is great, yes. So you change the environment and you starve them out in the territory that they've conquered, and they can't do the logistics and supplies back. So if you think about that for defense in an organization, you're not defending at the border with your army all lined up. You have defense in depth. And, people talk about defense in depth, but they think about it as 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 layers. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about infinite, just basically a complete changing nature of the environment at all times, and a constant surveillance of the environment to understand what's going on within it, so that you could actually help direct your adversary to where you want them in your environment. As you see them coming in, you move them to the places you want them to be, and you change the environment around them. and so that they get lost in your space. And that is what I would advocate organizations look at. There are capabilities to do this, and that they work with partners, governments, other agencies, whatnot, law enforcement, so that they can report, okay, we've seen this coming in. Here's who, we think is doing it. Maybe your shared intelligence will tell me, confirm that for me or not. And this is what tools they're using to get in. This is what they're doing once they're inside. This is what we are doing to confuse them, to obfuscate the target area inside the organization, and to allow them to get lost and allow them to basically starve here. And if we could do that, then it's not worth it for them. The return on investment goes way down. The longer you have to be there, the more work you have to do to find what you're looking for, the less it's worth the effort.
The principles that you're talking about, right? Not necessarily the high, thick walls. You want that defense in depth. I mean, zero trust principles, right? We've been talking about those for a while. It's really hot. And it's a different fundamental view. Instead of defending to the perimeter, you're going to segment, right? And you're going to have walls and checks and authentication and so forth throughout the organization, which again, every one of those gives an opportunity to trap, to confuse, to detect, and potentially to contain the attackers. Again, forcing them to move in ways that they didn't want, expend more energy, be shut down at different phases. That type of methodology we've seen in warfare at work, in traditional warfare, and we're seeing the benefits in the digital landscape as well. So, it's got precedent, and it's a matter of how well you can adapt your environment to make it unfriendly. And on the other side, it's how well the attacker can adapt to these new types of controls. Again, we see this now potential arms race and skills race. But at the end of the day, if you have those types of controls which can confound and cause problems, does it simply make it a situation where the attacker's going to go to somebody easier? Right? The heck
Exactly.
with this. Why do I want to attack
Yes.
Jeremy when Matthew's so much easier, right? This is I don't have to outrun the bear. I
Yes.
just have to outrun Matthew, right? And again, that has worked in the past.
Yeah, you don't want to be tripping the other guy just to make sure that they fall as you're running, but you want to work together and make sure that the community rises as a whole, that the capability in the community, so that the entire community is no longer as easy of a target. And if you could do that through intelligence sharing, through cooperative organizations like the ISACs and whatnot, that everybody then benefits. And the obfuscation, the complication of the attacker's job then makes it so that, oh man, I should be doing something else, is the appealing option for the attacker. What else could I do to get the outcome I want? Because this isn't the way to do it. And it's an economic decision at that point. And, the economics has been driving this whole thing the whole time. So change the economics. It's not about what newfangled technology I could use. It's about simply changing the economic validity of the use of this tool.
So, you talked about hardening and raising kind of all boats, making sure it's more difficult. The EU right now is looking to evaluate some new cyber regulations that are going to require products, for example, not to release to the public if there's known vulnerabilities. And you would think, well, shouldn't they be doing that already? No, actually, they don't do that. There's no requirements for them to do that. And all sorts of other things to kind of again make sure that the base landscape is a little bit more difficult to permeate with attacks. And especially when we start discussing supply chain attacks. If I can undermine a fundamental technology that everybody's using or a large community is using and get inside there, now I have access to that customer base, that large community. One hack, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of potential victims, and I can cherry pick. How important do you see regulations around digital products, hardware, software, firmware, virtuals, SaaS, all those kinds of things? How important is that moving forward? And what is the role, do you think, of governments versus those businesses themselves almost self-regulating?
This gets into a larger argument about self-regulation and the use of government in terms of running an economic system and a market economy. And my argument is that you need regulation in order for a market economy to be sustainable. Because without it, you don't get a market economy. You get oligopolies, monopolies, and rent seeking. What this regulation you were talking about within the EU, yeah, it creates a baseline. It says you can put a product to market when it's ready. Don't be bringing it to market when it's not. And companies often make the choice of how soon can we get it out there? What's the minimum viable product that we can release? And then what are we required to do to continue getting the sales we want? That's the economic argument for most private organizations. The economic argument for government is we don't want you to do that because if you do, you screw all of us. And if you screw all of us, we all lose, including you, because when all this is stolen and when everything breaks, they're coming after you, they're coming after all your clients, and you lose. And companies are more often than not willing to make that bet because they're like, what are the odds?
Or I'll be big enough by then. I'll have succeeded by then. Sure, I'll deal with that down the road.
Exactly. I don't need to invest in that now. That's something that may or may not happen in the future. Screw it. So, and it's a way to protect companies from their market-driven view of I'm going to only pay what I need to pay for right now. And so it changes the market and provides them a market to say it's worth paying for this right now because I need to pay for that in order to get this thing into the sales space. So it provides that even playing field. It increases the capability across the board, and it's a protection against my short-sighted decision to cut corners in order to get the product to the market in a way that is not what the actual market needs. So I'm a huge advocate of it. Now, admittedly, they shouldn't be going in and saying, okay, we need to put in 50,000 different regulations and make it, completely prescribed by the government. No, nobody needs that. But a minimum capability and a minimum agreement that, what you put out there needs to be safe. Yeah, that's not hard, and if you're not putting something out that's safe, well, you shouldn't be putting it out. It's kind of basic.
You would think it's common sense. And I've got a differing view slightly than yours. I mean, personally, and I've come from big tech companies and I've seen this. I hate regulation. I absolutely, positively hate regulations because they stifle innovation. Right? They make decisions for companies who are driving things into the market. They are woefully inadequate to be comprehensive in almost all cases because they are lagging. It takes so long for a regulation to get drafted and approved and debated and put into law and enacted and then enforced. It's just, but the regulations you create today were effective 5 years ago, but not for the threats today, right? But there is a caveat there that when the normal market forces of driving profitability and competitiveness, and I'm going to put out a better product than the other company because, I want to gain market share, right? All those good things, when those normal market forces that typically are servicing the end user, when those are not working right, when they're broken, that's when I've got to take a step back and just bite my tongue and go, you know what? We have to have regulation. We have to. If The companies and the businesses aren't doing the right thing. Ah, fine, fine, we have to have that. We saw that in privacy. We saw where companies just didn't care. And they were taking, stealing, using, selling private data, not even securing it properly. And it required legislators from all over the world to come in and go, no, you're victimizing these people and you don't care. So we're going to put regulations in place. And I hate to say it, but I think when we look at the software and hardware and everything in between, that world, I think those manufacturers, those creators, those wonderful innovators are in that same trap that they are not making things secure. And I hate to say it, but I think it is time that some regulations come out just for common sense. Stop putting hackable, easily hackable technology in the hands of your customers, and we're just going to call them victims because that's what they're going to be, right? Spend the extra time. And we're going to make sure everybody has to spend the extra time. So not only are we raising all boats for the benefit of security, we're raising the requirements for everybody to have to invest and do this. So it's still an even playing field for the competition. And so those rules still apply, but we need it. So I hate regulations, but this is one of those cases that I think it's necessary.
That's exactly right. Is that clearly the market wasn't going to do this itself. And so governments have to. It's not the government is diving in because like, hey, we're the best here. No, it's like, look, nobody's doing this. It needs to be done. Though there is a challenge with that, and we've seen it with companies like Huawei, where say, okay, all the things manufactured in the US have to have this capability, and therefore all US companies use that. And what they didn't do is say, but you can only use US companies' products. And so all the US companies are looking around and be like, well, this thing costs 1/3 the price of this thing, but it's made in China. Which one do I use? Well, I'm going to use the one made in China because it's cheap. Well, yeah, that's going to come back to bite you in the, but so how do you do that? And so then the regulation becomes you can only use US manufactured things. And then that gets touchy because it's like, well, now you're cutting down on competition. But at a certain point, you're going to have to because you can't just always go to the cheapest thing and think you're going to get what you want out of it. And so many organizations did that for a very long time. A lot still do, but I think enough have learned, oh yeah, we shouldn't be buying all Huawei stuff and expect to have security.
When you talk about Huawei, a lot of that and the regulations and the orders around that really started with government and other critical infrastructure organizations, right? Power and water and government and communications, all around those. And those critical infrastructure sectors have been traditionally prime targets. Because if you take out the healthcare industry, right, the hospitals, for example, we saw that in Europe. We've seen attacks here in the US, all over the world. You take out the hospitals with ransomware, they want to pay, right? So there's financial incentives. You take out the government, they can't operate. Or you do disinformation campaigns, and now that changes the political landscapes, right? There are huge benefits in attacking another country's critical infrastructure, right? How do we as a nation, especially given in our country, critical infrastructure is predominantly run by private businesses. How do we prepare our nation's critical infrastructure to defend and recover from these nation state level types of attacks? Is this possible, and what do we need to do?
So it is really complex in terms of critical infrastructure because of so many of the technologies involved in distributing power, particularly, is that almost all of them are connected in some way, electronically, not necessarily by a wire, but through Wi-Fi and other means. And so if you're looking at that and you're saying, okay, then we need to only supply these with secure devices, okay, and secure switches and secure technologies. That's a huge investment. And there's a lot of critical infrastructure systems. And I mean, you look at just the Texas electricity grid on its own, it has trouble surviving when nobody's attacking it. So if you then add an element of assault,
Just a snowstorm, yes.
exactly, like, okay, nature's taking you out. Now you want a nation state to come in on, the side of nature. So like already General Winters on their case. You, you, it's very difficult if there isn't the investment there, if there aren't the choices made to have systems that are resilient, have systems that are secure in communication, have systems where people actually use real passwords, not just the default one out of the factory, because that's really the biggest problem.
That's static that can't be changed.
Exactly, right? And so it's more often than not, it's the decisions we make that cause us to be at risk. And the critical infrastructure organizations out there often are based on market decisions of it's not worth the investment to secure ourselves. Because what are the odds? Well, the odds are pretty high. They're getting higher. The cost of the investment is high, yes, but the cost of failure is higher. So, in I'll say cyber insurance companies look at critical infrastructure and go, we're not touching that. That's insane. There's no way they can make an actuary table on that. The way that they do it is to say, we need to put this investment in. Yes, it will cost more money. Yes, I will not have the profit numbers that I had last quarter because I'm going to invest in this. Yes, I might not grow as fast. Is it worth it? Well, I might exist in 3 years where I wouldn't otherwise. So I don't know. If that CEO is going to be there in 3 years, then it's worth it. If that CEO is going to be out in 4 months and with a golden parachute, then it's not.
That's scary, just of that. Okay, so last question, and I know you are an expert when it comes to history of warfare, right? The Great War, World War II, how it's impacted individuals, the small, the medium businesses, corporations, governments. What is your one lesson, given the fact that we've been talking about this new age of warfare that is growing and blossoming and is becoming more pervasive with these nation state level cyber attacks? What is the one lesson we all need to kind of understand that you would say, given your understanding and knowledge of these previous conflicts, of mankind? What should we learn from history as we look forward and move forward in the digital realm as compared to the kinetic one?
So at the end of all of my podcasts, I always say, may the lessons of history compel the world toward peace. And so the lessons we can learn from history in terms of warfare is actually war hasn't changed. And it's in this new domain, but it's the same thing. It's where is your enemy weak? How do you undercut them so you could win the battle without having to fight? And if you could figure that out, whatever domain you're operating in, and chances are you're operating in multiple domains if you're smart, then you will achieve your desired political outcome, which is all war is politics by other means. So look for ways to achieve that through cheap, non-confrontational action. And that's what the cyber domain and digital assaults are, is non-direct confrontation. And it's been effective so far. But the lessons we learned from that on the defensive side is, well, stop your opponent from doing that. Make yourself resilient. Make yourself able to not engage them where they want to engage, but engage them at your choice of location. Confuse them. Create a fog of war. It's all the same lessons that have been around for thousands of years. It's just how do we make them market driven because that's the economy we're in? Because they're all there. It's just, will people choose to spend that money to do those things right? And if they're willing to do that, and it's not just about how much you spend, that's not the answer. It's about making the right choices for the security of your organization, for the security of your people, and for the security of your country and the world at large. It's, are we going to go the cheap way, or are we going to do this properly? And if you choose the cheap way, you're going to pay. It's just not right yet.
So true, so true. Jeremy, thank you. It is always a pleasure, and your insights are so appreciated. Thank you so much for joining me today and having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it was fun.
And for all the listeners out there, please make sure to check out Jeremy's podcast, Threads of War, which tells true stories about World War I, World War II, and the wars that we keep fighting because of them from a first-person perspective. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to subscribe and catch all the Cybersecurity Vault episodes where we chat with industry leaders to dive into the most relevant and interesting cybersecurity challenges, perspectives, and best practices. We'll see you next time.